On a Tuesday morning in the middle of June in Fillmore County, Minnesota, Darla Brockman stood at the wire fence that separated her family's east pasture from the road and watched the grass on her side of that fence grow tall and tangled and strange-looking while every other pasture in the county had already been mowed flat. Her neighbors drove past on County Road 12 and slowed down. Some of them stopped. A few of them rolled down their windows and said things. None of those things were kind. The grass on Darla's side of that fence was knee-high in places, and it was going to seed in spots, and it looked, by any reasonable measure, like something had gone wrong, like someone had forgotten, like a young woman who had come back from the university with ideas had made her first real mistake in front of the entire county. Her cattle were standing in the far corner of the adjoining lot, separated from that tall grass by a temporary electric fence Darla had put up herself in late May. They looked at the grass. They looked at Darla. They looked back at the grass. They had been moved off that east pasture 6 weeks ago, and they were not happy about it. Darla was 23 years old, and she had been home from the University of Minnesota for exactly 11 months. Let me tell you about what was happening in the rest of Fillmore County that June, because you need to understand the world Darla was standing in before you can understand what she was doing. Every cattle operation in Fillmore County, Minnesota, ran on the same basic system in the summer of 2019. You put your cattle on your pastures in May. You rotated them through maybe 2 or 3 paddocks if you were organized, or you just let them graze the whole thing continuously if you weren't. You mowed whatever they didn't eat down to a few inches in June to keep it from getting weedy and rank. You spread some fertilizer. You hauled supplemental hay starting in late July or early August when the grass gave out in the heat, because it always gave out in the heat. You bought that hay from someone else, or you cut your own second crop if you had the ground for it. You did this because your father did this, and his father did this, and the extension office had a pamphlet that described roughly this same system, and the feed store in Preston had been selling the same fertilizer blends for 30 years to support roughly this same system. And nobody questioned it because it worked well enough, and changing it would require explaining yourself to people who had been farming since before you were born. This was not a decision. It was gravity. The Brockman family had been farming 680 acres in the southeast corner of Fillmore County since 1961. When Darla's grandfather Irvin had bought the original 320 acres from a neighbor who was getting out of cattle and getting into soybeans. The farm had grown over the decades, picking up parcels when they became available, and by 2019 it ran about 140 head of beef cattle across 5 pastures, totaling roughly 280 acres of grass ground, with the rest in hay ground, and a small corn operation that Darla's father, Lyle, maintained more out of habit than profitability. Lyle Brockman was a good farmer, not flashy, not particularly innovative, but steady and careful and deeply knowledgeable about the specific behavior of his specific land in his specific corner of Minnesota. He had been farming full-time since 1989, and he had never lost a calf to something he could have prevented. Never let a fence go until it was actually failing. Never let a bill go past 30 days. He was the kind of farmer who made farming look like it required no thought at all, which is the highest possible compliment and the most misleading possible impression. Lyle had been mowing his pastures in June since 1989. Let me tell you about Darla Brockman, because she's the reason this story exists, and she's different from every character this channel has told you about before. Darla was the second of Lyle and Carol Brockman's 3 children, and the only one who had come back to the farm after college. Her older brother, Kevin, was an engineer in Rochester. Her younger sister, Pam, was in nursing school in Duluth. Darla had gone to the University of Minnesota in 2014 to study animal science and had come back in 2018 with a degree, a notebook full of ideas, and a very specific professor's voice in her head that she could not turn off. That professor was a man named Dr. Terence Voss, who taught a course called Integrated Grazing Systems in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences, and who had spent 20 years before academia running a grass-fed beef operation in central Missouri before a bad fall from a grain bin had ended that career and redirected him toward teaching. Dr. Voss was not a theoretical man. He did not speak in abstractions. He spoke in pounds per acre and dollars per head and weeks of grazing season extended, and when he talked about managed rotational grazing and what it did to pasture root systems and soil biology and summer forage availability, he talked about it the way a mechanic talks about an engine he has personally rebuilt, which is to say, with a precision and a certainty that made you feel like you were being let in on something that should have been common knowledge decades ago, but somehow wasn't. What Dr. Voss taught, and what Darla had spent her last 2 years of college studying in detail, was this. Conventional continuous or semi-rotational grazing systems, combined with mowing, were systematically destroying the root depth and biological diversity of Midwestern pastures in ways that made those pastures dramatically more vulnerable to summer heat and drought stress. When you grazed a pasture and then mowed it down to 3 or 4 inches, you were removing the photosynthetic capacity of the plant at the exact moment it needed that capacity to rebuild root reserves. The plant responded by putting all its energy into regrowing leaf material as fast as possible, which meant it had nothing left to put into roots. Over years and decades of this treatment, pasture root systems became shallow. Shallow root systems couldn't access subsoil moisture. When July came and the rain stopped and the heat arrived, shallow-rooted pastures went dormant fast and stayed dormant long. Let me tell you about the science, because it's the part that changes everything. The research that Dr. Voss kept returning to in his lectures had been done at the Samuel Roberts Noble Foundation in Oklahoma and at several university extension programs in Missouri and Kansas, and it had been replicated enough times across enough soil types that by the late 2000s it was not particularly controversial among range scientists, even if it had not yet penetrated the consciousness of most working cattle farmers in Minnesota. The core finding was simple. Grass plants that were allowed to reach full height before being grazed, and then allowed to fully recover before being grazed again, developed root systems that could be 2 to 3 times deeper than plants under continuous or mow and graze management. In a dry July, a grass plant with a 12-inch root system and a grass plant with a 4-inch root system are living in completely different worlds. The shallow-rooted plant runs out of moisture and goes dormant. The deep-rooted plant keeps growing. The practical implication of this was called high-density adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which was a long name for a simple idea. You divided your pasture into more paddocks than you thought you needed, you grazed each one intensively for a short period, and then you left it alone for much longer than felt comfortable. 60 days of rest minimum, 70 was better. During that rest period, you did not mow it. You did not fertilize it. You let it grow tall and go to seed and look exactly like something had gone wrong, because that was what recovery looked like, and recovery was the whole point. The data from farms that had converted to this system was, in Darla's notebook, organized by year and by region and by rainfall category. In normal rainfall years, high-density adaptive management typically produced 10 to 15% more grazing days per acre than conventional systems. In drought years, the difference was not 10 to 15%. In drought years, the difference was the difference between having grass in August and not having grass in August. Operations on conventional management in drought years were typically buying hay by the second week of August. Operations on adaptive management in the same drought years were still grazing standing forage into September. The dollar per head numbers that Dr. Voss put on the board in his classroom were not subtle. Hay costs in a drought year for a 140-head operation could run anywhere from $18,000 to $35,000 depending on how bad the drought was and how long it lasted. Eliminating or dramatically reducing that cost was not a small thing. It was the difference between a profitable year and a year that cost you something you didn't have. Darla had come home with all of this in her notebook and in her head, and she had sat at the kitchen table in August of 2018 and laid it out for her parents on a Tuesday evening after supper. The kitchen went quiet. Carol Brockman stopped clearing the table. Lyle set down his coffee cup. Darla walked them through it. The root depth research, the recovery period requirements, the paddock division she was proposing for the east pasture and the south pasture, the temporary fencing costs, which she had already priced out at a local supplier in Lanesboro, the projected grazing day increase, the projected hay cost reduction. She had a spreadsheet printed out on 3 pages, and she put it on the table in front of her father, and she watched him read it. Lyle read it twice. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the maps she had drawn of the paddock divisions. He looked at the photographs she had printed of tall grass recovery periods on farms in Missouri and Kansas. He looked at his daughter. "I've been mowing those pastures for 30 years, he said. It wasn't an argument. It was closer to a confession. "I know," Darla said. Lyle looked at the spreadsheet again. "The east pasture's the one you want to start with? It's the one with the worst soil compaction and the shallowest root depth from the core samples I took in May. If it's going to work anywhere, it'll work there first." Carol Brockman, who had been listening from the kitchen counter, said, "She's right, Lyle. You know she's been thinking about this for 2 years. Lyle picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "Let me think about it," he said. That was August. By March of 2019, after a winter of Darla bringing him articles and studies and a recorded lecture by Dr. Voss that she had obtained directly from the university, Lyle Brockman said, "Okay, the east pasture. We'll see what happens." He didn't say it like a man who believed it. He said it like a man who trusted his daughter enough to let her try. Now, let me tell you about the man who made sure the entire county knew what Darla was doing, because you need to understand him before you can understand what his reaction meant. Gene Crowley was 61 years old in the spring of 2019, and he had been selling livestock feed and pasture management products out of his operation on the south end of Preston for 22 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built a business on a particular model of how pasture management worked, and he had built it well. He drove a clean white pickup truck, and he knew every farmer in the county by name, and he had genuine relationships with most of them that went back decades. He sponsored the Fillmore County 4-H livestock judging competition every year, and he had served 2 terms on the County Agricultural Advisory Board, and he gave a speech at the annual Farm Bureau dinner that people actually looked forward to, which is not a thing that happens often. Gene Crowley also held court every weekday morning from about 7 to 9 at the counter of the Preston Co-op, where he drank coffee and talked about what was happening on farms in the county with whoever came in. And what he said at that counter carried weight in the way that only a man who has been right often enough for long enough can carry weight. He was not arrogant in the way of a man who has never been tested. He was confident in the way of a man who has been tested and has passed, and there is a difference. But the practical result in terms of how he received information that contradicted his experience was roughly the same. Gene Crowley had heard about what Darla Brockman was doing to the East Pasture by the first week of June, which was about 2 weeks after she had moved the cattle off it and put up the temporary electric fence and let the grass start growing. He had heard about it from 3 different people before he said anything at the co-op counter, which meant he had been thinking about it, which meant what he said when he finally said it was not a casual remark. Darla was in the co-op on a Thursday morning in the second week of June, picking up a mineral supplement order when Gene Crowley was holding court at the counter with 2 other farmers, Wes Rasmussen and Don Ebersole, both of whom ran cattle operations in the county, and both of whom had been mowing their pastures the previous week. Darla heard her name before she rounded the end of the aisle. "Lyle's girl has got that East Pasture looking like an abandoned lot," Gene was saying. "Knee-high grass going to seed, cattle standing in the corner lot eating hay when there's a full pasture right there. I drove by it yesterday." "What's she doing?" Wes Rasmussen asked. "Some university thing?" Gene said. "Rotational system. Supposed to build root depth. You don't mow it, you don't graze it, you just let it grow, and apparently that's going to save you hay costs in August." He paused. "I've been selling pasture management products in this county for 22 years. You know what saves hay costs in August? Mowing in June, fertilizing right, and rotating your cattle the way your grandfather rotated them." Darla came around the end of the aisle with her mineral supplement order on the counter ticket and set it down in front of the register. The conversation stopped. Gene Crowley looked at her. He was not unkind about it. He was almost paternal, which was in some ways worse. "Darla," he said, "I was just talking about your East Pasture." "I heard," she said. "That's a 60-day rest period you're running?" 65 minimum, 70 preferred. Gene nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's deciding whether to say the thing he is thinking. He said the thing. "You know what's going to happen in July when that grass has been resting for 10 weeks and it's still rank and stemmy and your cattle won't touch it?" "They'll touch it," Darla said. "The leaf material regrows above the stem once the plant has recovered. The palatability comes back. That's what they told you at the university. That's what the research shows from Noble Foundation trials in Oklahoma, from University of Missouri Extension data across 12 farms over 6 years, and from a farm in Lyon County that converted in 2016 and hasn't bought a bale of hay in August in 3 years. She said it without heat. She said it the way Dr. Voss had taught her to say things, which was as if the data were simply present in the room, and she was pointing at it. "I can give you the citations if you want them." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gene Crowley smiled. It was a genuine smile, which made it worse. "Darla, I hope it works," he said. "I genuinely do. But I've seen a lot of university ideas hit Fillmore County pastures, and I've seen what happens when July comes and the grass isn't there and you've got 140 head to feed." He picked up his coffee cup. "Your dad know you're not mowing that pasture?" "It was his decision," Darla said. "I just gave him the information." Gene Crowley looked at Wes Rasmussen. Wes Rasmussen looked at Don Ebersole. Something passed between the 3 of them that didn't require words. Darla picked up her mineral supplement receipt and walked out. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When a 61-year-old man with 22 years of experience and genuine relationships and a track record of being right looks at a 23-year-old woman with a notebook and a university degree and smiles that particular smile, what is he protecting? Because it isn't always arrogance. Sometimes it's the weight of real experience, and real experience deserves respect. But sometimes, underneath the experience, there is something else. There is the business model that depends on farmers buying hay supplements and fertilizer on a particular schedule. There is the identity built on being the man who knows. There is the quiet, unexamined assumption that the way things have been done is the way things should be done. Not because anyone has tested that assumption recently, but because testing it would require admitting it was an assumption in the first place. Jean Crowley was not a villain. But that smile was not just about Darla's East Pasture. That smile was about everything he had built and everything he believed. And the fact that a 23-year-old woman with a notebook was standing in his county suggesting that both of those things might need adjustment. Darla drove home on County Road 12 and did not say anything about the co-op to her father at lunch. She went out to the East Pasture in the afternoon and walked it and took measurements and wrote in her notebook. The grass was at 14 inches in the tallest sections. The root crowns were healthy. The soil under her boots had a give to it that the continuously grazed paddocks didn't have, a slight sponginess that came from biological activity in the top layers, from the earthworm populations and the fungal networks that were rebuilding in the absence of compaction and chemical input. She wrote all of this down. Lyle watched her from the fence line for a while. He didn't say anything. He went back to the shop. That was June. Let me tell you about what July did to Fillmore County in 2019, because July is the part that answers every question. The summer of 2019 was not the worst drought in Fillmore County's recorded history. It was not 1988, and it was not 2012. But it was dry in a specific and damaging way that the county's pastures were not prepared for. The rains that normally came in June and kept the grass green into mid-July failed almost completely. June ended with less than half an inch of precipitation across most of the county. The first 2 weeks of July added almost nothing. Temperatures ran 5 to 8 degrees above normal for 3 weeks starting on July 8th, with overnight lows that stayed in the mid-60s and didn't allow the grass to recover from the daytime heat stress. On conventional pastures across the county, the grass that had been mowed to 3 inches in June and then grazed continuously through the early part of the season hit this heat and drought with root systems that had no depth to draw on. The soil at 4 inches was powder. The soil at 2 inches was cracking. The grass went dormant. It didn't die in most cases, but it stopped growing. And dormant grass and growing grass look the same from a distance, but they are not the same thing when you have 140 head of cattle that need to eat every day. By July 15th, Wes Rasmussen had called his hay supplier. By July 18, Don Ebersole had called his. Jean Crowley's phone was ringing with farmers he had known for 20 years, asking about hay supplement pricing and whether he had any square bale inventory they could draw on. Let me tell you about what was happening on the Brockman East Pasture on July 15, because this is the part that Darla had been working toward for 11 months. The East Pasture had been resting since late May. It had grown to between 18 and 22 inches across most of its area during the recovery period, which had given the grass plants the photosynthetic capacity to push roots down into the subsoil before the drought arrived. Darla had taken soil moisture readings at 4-inch, 8-inch and 12-inch depths in both the east pasture and the adjacent continuously grazed paddock on July 10th, 5 days into the worst of the heat. At 4 inches, the two paddocks were nearly identical. Dry, almost no available moisture. At 8 inches, the continuously grazed paddock was dry. The east pasture had measurable moisture. At 12 inches, the east pasture had soil moisture readings that were more than double what the adjacent paddock showed. The grass plants in the east pasture were still green. They were not growing fast, but they were growing. The root systems that had been allowed to develop through 65 days of recovery were pulling moisture from 12 inches down, while the roots of the mowed, continuously grazed paddock had nothing left to reach for. On July 16th, Darla opened the temporary electric fence on the first subdivision of the east pasture and moved 47 head of cattle onto it. She had divided the east pasture into 4 paddocks using temporary polywire fencing, and her plan was to graze each one for 4 to 6 days at high density before moving the cattle to the next one, which would give each paddock a minimum of 12 to 18 additional days of rest before the cattle returned. It was not a long rest by the standards of full adaptive management, but it was enough to keep the grass recovering faster than it was being consumed, which was the key metric. The cattle hit that tall grass like they had been waiting for it, which they had been. They were not put off by the height or the seed heads. They selected the leaf material first, working through the paddock methodically in the way cattle work through quality forage, and by the end of the first day, they had grazed the first section down to about 8 inches, which was exactly where Darla wanted it. Not grazed to the ground, not mowed to nothing, grazed to 8 inches, which left enough leaf material for rapid regrowth and enough root energy reserves to keep the plant alive through the continuing heat. Lyle Brockman stood at the fence on the evening of July 16th and watched his cattle graze. He had been watching pastures for 30 years, and he knew what cattle looked like when they were eating well, and he knew what they looked like when they were making do. These cattle were eating well. He didn't say anything to Darla that evening. He went in for supper, and he was quiet through most of it, and then he said, "The south pasture, the section we normally mow first. What would you need to do it differently next year?" Darla looked at him across the table. "I'd need to divide it into at least 6 paddocks. The topography makes it harder than the east pasture, and we'd need to move the cattle off it by early May to give it a full 60 days before the first grazing." "What's the fencing cost?" "I priced it in March, about $2,200 for the temporary setup." Lyle nodded. He picked up his fork. "Okay," he said. Carol Brockman, from across the table, caught Darla's eye and said nothing. She didn't need to. Let me tell you about the rest of July, because the story doesn't end with the cattle going into the east pasture. The heat continued through the 3rd week of July. The county's conventional pastures were in bad shape by July 20th. Farmers who had been rotating their cattle through 2 or 3 paddocks found that all 3 paddocks were dormant simultaneously, and the rotation was providing no benefit. The grass wasn't recovering between grazings because there was no moisture for it to recover with, and the root systems were too shallow to find moisture that wasn't there in the top 4 inches. Hay deliveries started arriving at farms across the county in the 3rd week of July. The price per ton was up because demand was up across a wide region. Farmers who had bought hay contracts in the spring were okay. Farmers who had not were paying spot prices, and spot prices in a regional drought are not kind prices. Darla's east pasture cattle were still grazing standing forage. She had moved them through 2 of the 4 paddocks by July 22nd, and the first paddock, which had been rested for 6 days since the first grazing, was already showing 2 to 3 inches of regrowth at the base. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell her that the root systems were intact and working. She was taking notes every day. Soil moisture readings, grazing heights before and after, estimated forage intake, cattle body condition scores. She was building the record that Dr. Voss had told her to build, because the record was the argument, and the argument was going to matter later. On July 24th, Gene Crowley drove past the Brockman East Pasture on County Road, 12 on his way to a farm call. He slowed down. The cattle were visible in the third paddock, grazing actively in the late afternoon heat. The grass in the first paddock, which had been grazed 8 days earlier, was visibly regrowing. The grass in the second paddock, grazed 4 days earlier, was still short but green. Gene Crowley did not stop. He drove on, but he had seen it. Let me tell you about the numbers, because the numbers are what Darla had been building toward since she sat down at the kitchen table in August of 2018. By August 10th, the Brockman East Pasture cattle had been grazing standing forage continuously since July 16th. 25 days of grazing from a pasture that would normally have been exhausted by July 20th under conventional management. Darla calculated the hay costs avoided at the going rate for grass hay in Fillmore County in August 2019, which was running about $185 per ton delivered. A 140-head cow-calf operation at that time of year needed roughly 25 to 30 pounds of hay per cow-calf pair per day when there was no standing forage available. For the 47 head on the East Pasture rotation, 25 days of avoided hay feeding worked out to approximately $1,400 in direct hay cost savings on that one pasture alone. That was not a life-changing number in isolation, but it was a real number, and it was only July, and the East Pasture was only one of 5. The full farm hay cost for the Brockman operation in the summer of 2019 came in at $3,200. The previous year, in a normal rainfall summer with conventional management, it had been $8,400. In 2017, another dry summer, it had been $14,700. The comparison was not perfect. 2019 was not 2017, but the direction was unmistakable, and Darla had the soil moisture data and the grazing records to show exactly why the numbers were different. She put all of this in a report, not because anyone had asked for a report, because Dr. Voss had told her that the farm was the laboratory and the notebook was the data, and the data was the thing that outlasted the argument. By the end of August, Darla had also been contacted by a woman named Ingrid Lindgren, who farmed 400 acres in the western part of the county, and who had driven past the Brockman place 3 times during July and had finally stopped and knocked on the door. Ingrid was 47 years old and had been farming since her husband's death in 2014, and she was not a woman who knocked on doors easily, which meant she had thought about it for a while before she did it. She sat at the Brockman kitchen table for 2 hours, while Darla walked her through the paddock maps and the soil moisture data and the grazing records, and she left with a copy of the 3-page spreadsheet that Darla had originally made for her father and a list of the research citations that Dr. Voss had assigned in his course. 3 weeks later, Ingrid Lindgren called Darla and said she was going to divide her home pasture into 8 paddocks in the spring, and she wanted to know if Darla would come out and help her plan the fencing layout. Darla said yes. Now, let me tell you about the morning in September when Gene Crowley drove into the Brockman yard, because that morning is the reason this story gets told. It was a Thursday in the second week of September. The heat had broken in mid-August and some rain had come and the county's pastures were recovering. Slowly, the way they always recovered after a hard summer, which was to say, incompletely, and with a tiredness that would carry over into next year's root depth if nobody changed anything. Gene Crowley pulled his white pickup into the Brockman yard at about 8 in the morning, and Darla was in the barn doing morning checks when she heard the truck. She came out of the barn, and Gene Crowley was standing by his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and had then decided against the rehearsed version and was now working without a script. "Darla," he said. "Gene," she said. He looked at the east pasture, which was visible from the yard. It was green, not lush, not perfect, but green and growing in a way that the pastures on the farms he had visited that morning were not. "I've been doing farm calls all week," he said. "Guys I've known for 20 years. Their pastures look like parking lots." Darla waited. "I drove past here in July," he said. "I saw the cattle grazing." "I know," she said. "I saw your truck." Gene Crowley looked at her. Something in his face had shifted from the morning at the co-op counter in June, and it wasn't quite humility, and it wasn't quite apology, but it was something in the neighborhood of both. "I told Wes Rasmussen in June that you were going to be buying hay by August," he said. "I told Don Ebersole the same thing." "I know that too," Darla said. He nodded slowly. "What would it take to do what you did on the east pasture on a 400-acre operation?" Darla looked at him for a moment. She had thought about this moment, not obsessively, but she had thought about it the way you think about a conversation you know is coming. She said, "You told Wes and Don that you'd been selling pasture management products in this county for 22 years, and you knew what worked." Gene Crowley didn't look away. "I did say that. The research I cited that morning in the co-op was from the Noble Foundation and from University of Missouri Extension data and from a farm in Lyon County that's been running adaptive management since 2016. I offered you the citations." "You did?" "The lesson isn't that my east pasture is better than Wes Rasmussen's pasture," Darla said. "The lesson is that any operation that manages its ground the same way in every year, regardless of what the ground is telling it, is an operation that's one bad July away from a very expensive problem. The ground doesn't care what's worked for 22 years. It responds to what you do to it this year and last year and the year before that." Gene Crowley was quiet for a moment. A truck went past on County Road 12, and neither of them looked at it. "Will you come out and look at the Rasmussen place with me?" he said. "And the Ebersole place. I want to show them what you did, and I want you to explain it." Darla considered this. "I'll come out," she said, "but I'm not going to tell them it's easy or that it works the first year without problems, because it doesn't. The first year's hard, and it looks wrong, and your neighbors think you've lost your mind. That's part of the deal." "Fair enough," Gene said. He extended his hand. Darla shook it. He got in his white pickup and drove back down the county road, and Darla stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the east pasture, which was green in the September light, and then she went back into the barn. "Let me tell you about what happened in the 3 years after that September morning, because the story doesn't end in the Brockman yard." In the spring of 2020, Darla divided the Brockman South pasture into 6 paddocks using the temporary fencing system she had priced out in March of 2019. She also helped Ingrid Lindgren lay out 8 paddocks on her home pasture in the western part of the county. The Rasmussen operation converted 2 of its 4 pastures to adaptive management that spring, with Darla doing the planning and the fencing layout in exchange for a day's use of Wes Rasmussen's skid steer, which she needed for a drainage project on the Brockman East pasture anyway. Don Ebersola converted one pasture. Cautiously. He was not a man who moved fast, but he moved. Gene Crowley stopped selling the June mowing recommendation to his customers as a blanket prescription. He didn't announce this change. He just stopped doing it and started asking questions about paddock rest periods and root depth and soil moisture before he made recommendations, and some of his customers noticed the change and some didn't. He drove past the Brockman place regularly enough that Darla started recognizing his truck by the sound of it on the county road. The summer of 2020 was wetter than 2019, and the difference between adaptive and conventional management was less dramatic, which was the expected result and which Darla had told everyone to expect. The system wasn't about performing better in good years. It was about performing catastrophically better in bad years, and good years were not the test. The summer of 2021 was the test. Let me tell you about the summer of 2021 in Fillmore County, because 2021 is when the argument ended. The drought of 2021 was the worst Fillmore County had seen since 1988. June rainfall was 0.4 inches. July rainfall was 0.7 inches. Temperatures in July ran consistently 8 to 12 degrees above normal. The USDA Drought Monitor had the county in severe drought by July 10th and extreme drought by July 25th. It was the kind of summer that aged farmers visibly, that made men who had been farming for 30 years look like they had been farming for 40. On conventional pastures across the county, the grass was gone by July 12th. Not dormant, gone, in the sense that even the dormant plants were dying in the top inch of soil because there was nothing for them to draw on. Hay prices spiked to $225 per ton and then to $240, and there were days when you couldn't get a delivery commitment for less than 3 weeks out. Farmers who had been through 1988 said it felt the same. Farmers who hadn't been through 1988 said they hoped they never saw another summer like it. The Brockman operation had, by the summer of 2021, converted 4 of its 5 pastures to adaptive management. The 5th, a small 8-acre lot that Lyle used for the bull and a few dry cows, was still managed conventionally because Lyle had not gotten around to fencing it and Darla had not pushed him on it. That 8-acre lot went dormant on July 14th. The 4 adaptive pastures kept growing, not fast, not luxuriantly, but growing, the way a plant grows when it has roots deep enough to find moisture that the drought hasn't reached yet, which is to say with a quiet stubbornness that has nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what happened to the root system in the 3 years before the drought arrived. The Brockman operation bought no hay in July of 2021. They bought a small quantity in the last week of August, when even the adaptive pastures were feeling the stress of a summer that had now run nearly 3 months without meaningful rain. The total hay expenditure for the summer of 2021 was $1,850. Wes Rasmussen, on his 2 non-converted pastures, spent $19,400 on hay that summer. Don Ebersola spent $16,200. A neighbor 2 miles north of the Brockman place who had not converted any pastures spent $28,000 and sold 12 head of cows he couldn't afford to feed. Darla had the numbers in her notebook by September 1st. She also had 3 years of soil core data showing root depth progression in the converted paddocks, and the numbers were almost exactly what the Noble Foundation research had predicted. Root depths in the East pasture, which had been under adaptive management the longest, had increased from an average of 4.2 inches at the start of the program to an average of 9.7 inches by the summer of 2021. In the worst drought in 33 years, those roots were the difference. Lyle Brockman sat at the kitchen table in September of 2021 and looked at the hay cost comparison for the third year in a row and said, "You were right." He said it simply, without drama, the way a man says something he has known for a while and has finally decided to say out loud. "You were right in August of 2018 when you put that spreadsheet on the table and I didn't know enough to say yes right away." "You said yes," Darla said. "That's what mattered." "I said yes to one pasture," Lyle said. "You should have had all 5. Carol Brockman was standing at the kitchen counter, and she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had said it 3 years ago. Lyle looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. "The corn ground," he said. "The 40 acres on the north end. I want you to tell me what you'd do with it if it were yours." Darla looked at him. "You want to hear about cover crops?" "I want to hear about whatever you think makes sense," Lyle said. "You decide." "Let me tell you about the fall of 2022, because the story has one more turn before it settles. In October of 2022, Darla was invited to speak at the Fillmore County Soil and Water Conservation District annual meeting in Preston. The invitation came from the district conservationist, a woman named Paula Hartwell, who had been following the Brockman operations data since 2020 and who had been using it in her own educational materials for farmers in the county. The meeting was held at the Preston Event Center on a Wednesday evening, and it drew about 90 farmers, which was a larger crowd than the Conservation District meeting usually drew. And the reason it drew that crowd was that word had gotten around about what the Brockman pastures had done in the summer of 2021, and people wanted to understand it. Darla stood at the front of the room with a projector and her data, and she walked 90 farmers through 3 years of soil core results, grazing day calculations, hay cost comparisons, and the underlying science of root depth and soil moisture that explained all of it. She was 26 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket and her hair was pulled back, and she looked like every other farmer in the room except that she was standing at the front of it. She showed the 2021 hay cost comparison on a slide. The room was quiet in a specific way, the way a room gets quiet when people are doing arithmetic in their heads and not liking what the arithmetic is telling them about the past 3 summers. Gene Crowley was in the room. He was sitting in the 3rd row on the left side, and he was not holding court. He was listening. Darla saw him when she first walked in, and she did not make eye contact, and he did not try to catch hers. When she finished, there were questions for 40 minutes. Practical questions, specific questions, the kind of questions that come from people who are already thinking about implementation rather than whether to implement. How many paddocks per acre? What temporary fencing systems worked best in clay soils? Whether the system worked for sheep as well as cattle? What to do in the first year when the pasture looked wrong and the neighbors were talking? On that last question, Darla paused for a moment and then said, "The first year is the hardest year because you're managing for a future you can't see yet. The pasture looks wrong. The neighbors notice. Some of them will tell you that you're making a mistake." She did not look at Gene Crowley. What gets you through the first year is the data, because the data tells you what's happening underground, even when everything above ground looks like a problem. Trust the data. Take the soil cores, write the numbers down. The ground will tell you if it's working. After the meeting, as people were putting on their coats and talking in small groups, Gene Crowley walked to the front of the room. Darla was packing up her laptop. He waited until the people around her had moved away. "Good talk," he said. "Thank you, Gene." He looked at the projection screen, which was blank now. "I've been recommending the adaptive rest period to my customers since last spring," he said. "Not all of them, the ones I think will do it right. I heard, Darla said. Ingrid Lindgren told me. I should have listened in June of 2019, he said. It came out flat and direct, the way a man says something he has been carrying for a while and has finally decided to put down. Darla zipped up her laptop bag. You listened in September, she said. That's earlier than most. Gene Crowley nodded once and put on his jacket and walked out. Darla watched him go and then finished packing up and turned off the projector light. Lyle Brockman was in the back row. He had been there the whole time, which Darla had known and had not acknowledged from the front of the room. As the last people filtered out, he stood up and put on his coat and walked down the center aisle to where his daughter was standing. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, and then he picked up the box of printed handouts she had brought and carried it out to her truck. That was all. That was enough. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end in October of 2022. In the spring of 2023, Darla's 20-year-old cousin, Peter Brockman, who was finishing his second year at Riverland Community College in Austin, and who had been spending his summers on the farm since he was 12, came to the Brockman kitchen table with a printed article from a regenerative agriculture journal, and a hand-drawn map of the North 40 acres that Lyle had turned over to Darla 2 years earlier. Peter was studying natural resources management, and he had the look of a young man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it out loud. He put the article and the map on the table in front of Darla. The article was about integrating small-grain cover crop cocktails with cattle grazing as a soil carbon sequestration strategy, with data from farms in Nebraska and South Dakota showing measurable organic matter increases over 4-year periods. The map showed the North 40 divided into strips, with notations about species mixes and grazing windows and soil testing intervals. Darla looked at the article. She looked at the map. She looked at her cousin, who was watching her with the particular anxiety of someone who has just put an idea in front of a person whose opinion matters to them. She thought about August of 2018. She thought about the kitchen table and the 3-page spreadsheet, and her father saying, "Let me think about it," and her mother saying, "She's right, you know," and the 11 months between that conversation and the moment she opened the fence on the east pasture and let the cattle in. "Have you pulled the soil organic matter baseline on those strips?" she asked. "Not yet," Peter said. "I was going to do it this week if you thought it was worth doing." "It's worth doing," Darla said. "Pull the cores from 6 locations minimum, 2 depths each, and get me the contact information for whoever did the Nebraska study. I want to read the full methodology before we design the trial." Peter Brockman nodded and picked up his map and his article and walked out of the kitchen with the energy of a young man who has just been told yes. Darla sat at the kitchen table for a moment after he left. Through the window, she could see the east pasture, green in the April light, the grass coming up through the thatch of last year's growth, the soil underneath it doing the slow invisible work that soil does when you stop fighting it and start listening to it. The work that had been happening down there since 2019, root by root, season by season, in the dark below the surface where nobody could see it until July came and the rain didn't. She got up and got her notebook and went out to pull soil cores. Darla Brockman planted tall grass in a mowed county. They laughed. July came. The rain didn't. The mowed pastures died. The tall grass lived. The notebook was right. The ground already knew. Nobody had bothered to ask it.